Hello everyone, my name is Josh Wolper, and I'm a fourth year PhD student here at Penn, working with Dr. Jiang. And now that you've gotten an introduction to the material point method and some of the math and the routines, I'm here to show you the exciting potential of MPM as a baseline for different types of simulation using various physical augmentations. More specifically, over my time here at Penn, my research has focused heavily on simulating material fracture using MPM, so today I'll be giving an idea of how we can model this difficult to capture effect by augmenting the material point method. Today's lecture will give you a primer on what kind of research is being done with MPM right now and what goes into successful MPM papers. So without further ado, let's get started. So first let's start with some motivation as to why MPM is such an exciting method for animating all of these physical effects. First and foremost, MPM has what's known as an updated Lagrangian formulation, meaning that it measures deformations as changes between individual time steps. Conversely, methods like finite element method often use a total Lagrangian formulation, which means that the tetrahedral deformations are measured as changes from an initial reference configuration. This UL formulation allows MPM to robustly handle extremely large deformations and topological changes, making it ideal for both solids and fluids, as well as elastoplastic materials like snow and sand. Second, MPM has intrinsic collision handling due to the underlying interpolation routines averaging velocities at these collision interfaces. These collisions aren't entirely physically accurate due to the averaging, but MPM materials do naturally resist interpenetration for free, whereas in FEM these collisions are arduously handled with many different penetration checks on the updated meshes. Third, MPM research is quickly amassing a breadth of physical effects in materials including snow, sand, sediment flow, continuum foams, melting, phase change, and of course, fracture. And finally, one of the most exciting things about MPM to me is the physical accuracy of the method, making it not only successful for producing these beautiful physically based animations, but also extremely useful in real-world simulation and scientific computing. MPM has already seen extended use for predicting gravitational hazards, for example, like avalanches and landslides, and today I'll show a bit of my recent work on glacial calving and the ensuing tsunamis this can create. But what about material fracture? Why do we care about how materials fail over time? Well, as you might imagine, physically modeling fracture is extremely useful to many fields, including video games, which we see above represented by a recent clip of Crackdown 3's real-time destruction system, visual effects for movies, shown above right through the final city leveling shot of 1999's Fight Club, and finally, the fields of mechanical and civil engineering have focused on modeling fracture for many years to prevent the type of disaster shown in the image below, showing the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse due to strong winds in 1940. Unfortunately, despite all of this serious motivation, fracture is quite a difficult natural phenomenon to model in an elegant and robust way. So naturally, each application of fracture modeling has different ideas about what successful fracture modeling should achieve, because we can't achieve it all at the same time yet. Real-time applications such as video games strongly favor speed over accuracy and often avoid fracture physics entirely, while offline simulation for movies and VFX focuses on artistic control and the look of fracture rather than accuracy. And finally, engineering applications were the first to inspire the study of the physics behind fracture due to a need for predictive accuracy rather than speed or look. And for the purposes of this lecture, I'll focus somewhere in between the look-driven approaches in computer graphics and the physically accurate approaches from the engineering literature. And finally, I want to give you some intuition about what pieces we need for successful fracture modeling. The first is some governing physical theory that describes how cracks begin and how they grow. The second is a way to discretize material geometry and the underlying partial differential equations that govern fracture. And lastly, we need a way to track and represent the growing crack front, which can be tricky due to the extreme topology change intrinsic to fracture. For today's lecture, we'll be focusing on approaches and demos from my three most recent works, so first I'll give you a bit of an overview of these methods. The first work, CD-MPM, actually has two very distinct approaches to modeling fracture. The first is PFF-MPM, which is an augmented MPM solver, and the second is NACC Plasticity, which actually models fracture purely through plasticity with no damage model needed. The second work, AnisoMPM, is an even better augmented MPM solver for modeling the fracture of anisotropic materials like meat and mozzarella cheese. AnisoMPM also contains an additional approach to modeling extremely stiff materials, but more on this later. And finally, the third work is actually not yet published, but is in fact under review at Nature Communications Earth and Environment, and in it we present a modification of NACC plasticity that we found to accurately match real-world analytical models for glacial calving and tsunami genesis. So now that you have a sense of the papers we'll be covering, let's look at the remaining roadmap for this lecture. I'll break down these fracture papers into 3 pieces. The first is how we approach modeling material damage over time, and this can be done with either meshed or unmeshed discretizations. The second is how we model the material's elastic response, or how strongly it resists elastic deformation. And finally, some approaches, as I just mentioned, are able to model material fracture through tracking material plasticity, or how much a material hardens or softens based on the underlying plastic deformations. For each of these 3 sections, I'll first discuss some background topics, then delve a little bit into the theory, and then, of course, show off all the cool demos we have. And then finally, at the end, I'll recap what's already been accomplished, as well as discuss some exciting directions for future study. So with that, let's jump into meshed approaches to fracture. So using a mesh to discretize a material surface or volume is an extremely common practice in computer graphics, and fracture simulation is no different. Most early approaches to animating fracture are centered on the finite element method, or FEM, and in FEM, a material is discretized as a set of tetrahedrons that we individually process, with each tet remembering its initial reference configuration. Then, during simulation, each tet deforms in world space based on the internal and external forces applied to them by using the reference configuration to determine the overall deformation, and recall that this is a total Lagrangian formulation. FEM fracture in graphics saw success as early as 1998 with the brittle and ductile fracture works introduced by O'Brien et al., seen at top left. However, FEM poses significant geometric and computational challenges when used to model fracture, including the need to remesh near crack geometry and the need to represent evolving and branching crack topology. These are such non-trivial problems that they've spawned myriad research efforts just to address them. And at top middle, we see the boundary element method, or BEM, used for brittle fracture. BEM seeks to instead discretize the surface of a volume and computes cracks occurring in the interior of the volume. And this method has gained some traction in recent years, but has never been used for ductile fracture and is computationally expensive. At top right, we see the discontinuous Galerkin method used to augment FEM with the ability to handle material discontinuities. And DG-FEM has seen much success in realms outside of fracture, but it is quite computationally intensive and still subject to many mesh issues. At bottom left, you can see an FEM-based thin shell fracture approach that even achieved anisotropic fracture of thin shell materials. And finally, at the bottom right, you can see an example of a cutting simulation using the extended finite element method. XFEM is a remesh-free cutting algorithm that has seen much success lately. However, it still does struggle with being quite complex, as well as with the typical FEM problems like handling self-contact and degenerate mesh configurations. Conversely, meshless approaches to fracture seek to obviate some of these mesh-related issues, and have also seen significant study over the years, such as the moving least squares approach of Polly et al. In 2005, but perhaps the most notable advances in meshless fracture animation have come out of leveraging the material point method. As you now know, MPM affords us some really nice properties like multi-material simulation, natural contact, and it has an intrinsic robustness to extreme topology changes. However, MPM is not infallible, and in fact greatly struggles with strong velocity discontinuities. And as you can imagine, a fracturing material has strongly discontinuous velocities at the crack interface. As such, some recent works seek to find ways around this. For example, in 2013, Hegeman et al. Successfully modeled MPM fracture using a level set augmentation, and 2018 brought the advent of the compatible particle in-cell method, or CPIC. And CPIC is successful at simulating sharp discontinuities, but unfortunately incorporates no fracture physics, and accordingly it's quite limited. So as such, in my fracture works, we combine the great qualities we get from MPM with the real-world fracture physics developed for years in the mechanics and engineering communities. Now before diving in, let's go over a couple of background topics, starting with MPM itself. So, as you know, MPM is a hybrid method, and more specifically, it discretizes a material both as a set of particles and as a grid of nodes. MPM uses the particles to keep track of data like velocity and position, while the grid nodes are used as a scratchpad for force computations. The core loop of MPM entails transferring data from the particle view to the grid view, and then using the grid to perform force computations and update velocities. Then, the updated velocities are transferred back to the particles and used to advect particle positions, and then this loop repeats. So let's take a look at this data flow taken from Gomez et al. 2018, the aforementioned avalanche paper. And notice that the green boxes indicate particle views, while the yellow boxes show the grid view. We begin at the top left, where we have our particle positions, masses, and velocities. Step 1 is to transfer our mass and momentum to the grid using our interpolation routine, so labeled 1 we see the grid mass and momentum. Next, in step 2 we calculate the external and internal forces on the body, so that in step 3 we can update the velocities on the grid. Here, external forces typically refer to gravity, and internal forces refer to the internal elasticity of the material. And we can model this elasticity using a constitutive model that gives us a relationship between the deformation and the material's energy density. So for example, the fixed co-rotated model that you saw recently. After we update velocity on the grid, we transfer this velocity back to the particles using our interpolation routines to get the particle velocities seen in step 8, and then we can use these particle velocities to update particle positions seen in step 9. And the really cool thing here is that to augment MPM with effects like melting or fracture, we can simply introduce new data to the particle view like temperature or material damage, transfer this to the grid, and then use the grid to update these elements using governing theories from mechanics and physics before transferring back to the particle. But I'm sure by now you're wondering what's going on with steps 4 to 7. These steps are unique to modeling plasticity within MPM, and we'll look at this more later when we discuss plasticity, but I'll give you a brief overview in the meantime. So step 4 shows our deformation gradients. Step 5 shows that we use these deformation gradients to check whether a particle's stress is inside of what's known as a yield surface, and if not, step 6 performs return mapping for this particle. Otherwise, we skip to step 7. And in any case, for simplicity, you can think of MPM's treatment of plasticity as a post-process on the deformation gradient. So next, I'll give you a brief introduction to continuum damage mechanics and phase field fracture. Most of the fracture methods I've discussed so far utilize what's called linear elastic fracture mechanics, or LEFM, which requires explicitly modeling the evolving and branching crack geometry. Conversely, continuum damage mechanics, or CDM, uses a smeared crack approach, also known as diffuse crack modeling, which assumes the material remains a continuum, and instead the mechanical properties of the material are weakened at the cracks to account for the effects of fracture. And within CDM, damage can be modeled either locally, such as through comparing local stresses with some defined maximal stress, or non-locally through tracking a scalar field of damage variables evolving over time. And this latter approach is known as phase field fracture, or PFF. And you guessed it, PFF-MPM is a phase field fracture augmented MPM approach. So we can augment MPM with phase field fracture through tracking damage in the particle view and evolving damage variables on the grid, which then in turn affect the force computations. These phase values are constrained to be between 0 and 1, with 0 being healthy material and 1 being fully damaged material. And in the image at right, the disk is considered to be a continuum in material space at left, but the phase is tracked such that in the high damage red region, we see material separation at right because the material has been weakened at the crack. The damage variables that we track and evolve influence the material's elastic response through a method of elastodamage coupling known as elasticity degradation. In this context, we achieve this by multiplying a monotonic degradation function, g, that's based on the current damage. And below you can see the degradation function to show how it goes from 1 to 0 as damage increases from 0 to 1. But more on this later when I talk about elasticity. So now that you've seen how we track damage on the particles, let's very briefly look at some details about the theory behind PFF-MPM, because we still need a way to update damage on the grid, and we can do this using fracture theory. So we begin with Griffith's theory of fracture, an expression for the total free energy of the material that's defined to be the summation of the elastic potential and the released energy at the crack surface. Here psi hat is a degraded energy density, T is the internal crack surface, and G is the critical energy release rate due to fracture. We can also express the energy density as a function psi of the deformation gradient F and the phase value C. This means that the total energy in terms of F and C is simply an integration over this energy density. We can then define this psi to be the balance between the degraded elasticity and the energy release from fracture through substituting in a split energy density for psi hat and the phase field approximation for the surface integral over T. So with this governing equation in hand, we can now formulate the phase field evolution rule by using Ginzburg-Landau theory and following general thermodynamics and kinetics, and by adding additional terms related to the damage C, we get the differential equation above. And really don't worry too much about the details here, but the big takeaway is really just that this strongly resembles a heat equation, in that we have a diagonal matrix as the first term, Laplacian as the second, and a scalar as the right-hand side. And fortunately, this form means that we can solve this using an iterative method, so ultimately we can use this equation that we discretized using MPM to update our grid damage. Also note that this equation introduces two key parameters for artistic control. The mobility constant, mc, dictates the speed of crack propagation, while the energy release rate, g, affects the material's resistance to fracture. And as you can see from these unit tests, changing these two parameters greatly affects the material fracture pattern and behavior, giving a high degree of artistic control. Now let's look at the data flow of PFF-MPM and see what's different from traditional MPM. The first key feature here is that we now additionally track phase, also called damage, per particle, and perform a similar set of steps to transfer, solve, and update phase values. We solve for the dynamics and the phase in a staggered manner with the phase solve occurring first, and by the dynamics we mean to say the traditional MPM pipeline for mass and momentum. So to solve the phase, we discretize the phase evolution equation from earlier to achieve a symmetric positive definite linear system for the unknown grid node phases, and then solve this system using an iterative method like I mentioned. And note that the blue arrow here shows that we use the particle's current deformation gradient in the phase solve on the grid, and then once the phase is solved and transferred back, the red arrow shows that we use the updated particle phase in the force computation to ensure that we've updated the damage before we compute forces. And as for the dynamics of the system, they're discretized in the same way as traditional MPM, with the only difference being that the grid force update now incorporates the updated phases to degrade the elastic potential and weaken the material at the crack. So with that, let's now take a look at our demos that use PFF-MPM. First, we smash together these two octocats and visualize the phase in the material space at the top. Blue particles indicate healthy material, while red indicates fully damaged material. And notice how you can see the highest damage at the places the arms break off. Next, we pull the limbs off of the classic armadillo model to see the dynamic fracture we achieve from tensile loading. And here we show the phase field to visualize the crack formation in real time. And just a warning in advance, there are a lot of armadillos in this lecture, and this is not the worst thing that happens to them. Next, when we shoot this Jello T-Rex with a bullet using traditional MPM, the fracture pattern is at the mercy of unpredictable numerical fracture, which is a unique type of MPM fracture that occurs when material is forced to tear non-physically. But with PFF-MPM, we get the desired trajectory through the T-Rex. And here, we again visualize the phase field to show crack formation and propagation. And sorry this looks kinda gory, but again the red just shows the highest damage particles. Next, we twist the Jello bar with traditional MPM to show that in some cases, numerical fracture alone cannot cause the desired fracture behavior, let alone any fracture at all. Fortunately, with PFF-MPM we achieve the desired fracture pattern as the Jello twists. Next up is a demo that I hardly ever show because it came out kinda crunchy, but here we show a getaway car crashing through a metal fence. And the takeaway here is that to model the metal, we had to pair PFF-MPM with Plasticity to model the ductile fractures associated with metal. Notice how the fence deforms and retains this deformed shape a bit, which is the result of the plasticity. And finally, the teaser photo. So here we slowly tear some bread to reveal the intricate fracture patterns and dynamics we associate with fresh bread. And again, we visualize here the phase field to show off all of the small fractures invisible in the render view. So as exciting as all of those results are, you might notice something in common among them, namely that they're all modeling isotropic materials, or those that have a completely uniform structure to them. As such, we introduced this year AnisoMPM, a new approach for animating anisotropic fracture. But before jumping in, let's do a quick overview of some anisotropy terminology. So firstly, isotropic materials behave the same in every direction. Think of a simple jello cube bouncing with its elastic response the same regardless of direction. Second, transversely isotropic materials have an underlying structure that strengthens just one axis of the material, and we'll call this axis A1. Many biological tissues exhibit transverse isotropy, including muscles, which allow different deformations in the longitudinal and transverse directions. And finally, orthotropic materials can define three mutually orthogonal axes that can each have different material responses, and we only need to label two of these, so we add A2 to label the second axis. The most intuitive example of an orthotropic material is wood, where the underlying fibrils change the behavior in the axial, radial, and circumferential directions. So with that in mind, let's take a quick look at some of the theory behind AnisoMPM. For the purposes of this lecture, let's consider the main difference between PFF-MPM and AnisoMPM to be that we have an underlying sense of the material's directional strength, and as such we need a way to incorporate this into the governing physics. In our formulation, we're inspired by an anisotropic crack-driving state function that's shown success for biological tissues. The exact form of d tilde is shown at the top, where we introduce some new symbols. Zeta controls the slope of the driving force, but we generally keep this to be 1 to further reduce the parameter space. The brackets are called Macaulay brackets, and preserve positive values while flattening all negative values to 0, as you can see in the graph at right, and you might know this function from machine learning as the rectilinear function, or ReLU. Finally, sigma plus is the tensile portion of Cauchy's stress, and is computed using the Cauchy eigenvalues and eigenvectors, as you can see in the second row. Next, we define an expression phi as a function of the tensile stress, seen in the third row, and we introduce here the notion of a critical stress, sigma c, that dictates how much stress a material can withstand before fracturing. And most important of all, the second-order tensor A is a structural tensor that encodes the material's intrinsic fiber directions. In the fourth row, you can see the structure of this tensor. Recall that A1 and A2 are the fiber directions, and we construct this tensor by adding contributions from each of these directions to the identity matrix using the alpha 1 and alpha 2 parameters to weight these contributions. As you can imagine, these alphas also give us great control over the type of anisotropy. For example, a material can be changed from orthotropic to transversely isotropic by simply setting alpha 2 to 0, and even further made to be fully isotropic by also setting alpha 1 to 0. At right, we also present 4 plots showing the behavior of our anisotropic crack-driving state function for 3 different fiber orientations as well as an isotropic material. Notice how for the 90-degree or vertically oriented fibers, as stress increases in the fiber direction, sigma 2, d tilde stays constant, but it increases quite rapidly due to stress in the weak orthogonal direction. And conversely, for the isotropic material, we see that it responds identically to stress in every direction. Next, let's overview the AnisoMPM data flow to give some intuition about how it works. We start with the basic MPM data pipeline, where we transfer damage to the grid, compute forces and update velocity, and then transfer these new velocities back. Next, we see that AnisoMPM utilizes a staggered integration scheme and introduces a second data pipeline for damage transfer and evolution, similarly to PFF-MPM. However, note that so far this is just the pipeline for explicit damage. We use the current particle deformation gradients to update damage, and then damage is used to update grid velocity through elasticity degradation. In AnisoMPM, we also present a method for evolving damage using implicit time integration, using a similar data flow. And finally, note that our inextensibility solver is implemented as a hard constraint on updated grid velocity, and we show this in the momentum pipeline, but more on inextensibility when we talk about elasticity. This is the treatment for high stiffness materials that I mentioned was part of AnisoMPM earlier. Now let's get some intuition behind the material effects attainable through tuning these damage parameters. Here we show a 45-degree fibered block tearing using explicit damage. In the top row, we show the effect of increasing the critical stress, sigma c, and as you can see, this increases the material's resistance to fracturing. In the bottom row, we show the effect of drastically increasing our crack speed, eta, showing the sensitivity of this parameter. And note that in our discretization, our time step delta t is divided by the parameter eta, and as such, some eta values can actually cause stability problems when using explicit damage due to breaking the CFL condition. More specifically, if we want to simulate an extremely fast crack, we can use an extremely small eta value, but this can cause problems for our explicit damage formulation. So we show here the same 45-degree fibered block from earlier with an extremely small eta value. And as you can see, our implicit damage formulation is able to beautifully resolve this extremely fast crack, while explicit damage explodes as soon as the critical stress is reached by any particle. So, while implicit damage is naturally more cumbersome due to its system solve, it affords us the ability to use these larger time steps and very small eta values. Finally, let's take a look at our AnisoMPM demos. To kick things off, we show here a 45-degree fibered tube being stretched until it fractures. However, each of these 4 runs uses a different combination of AnisoMPM components. The top left is full AnisoMPM, and as you can see, we get a nice clean fracture there. The top right shows a run with isotropic damage and isotropic elasticity, showing a result we might expect from PFF-MPM. The most insightful runs, however, are on the bottom. On the left, we show the effect of using anisotropic damage but isotropic elasticity. Notice how the fracture is no longer as strongly guided as it was when we used anisotropic elasticity. And on the right, we show a run with no damage at all, but using anisotropic elasticity. And note that the tube stretches much further because this fracture is now purely numerical. And hopefully all of these tubes convince you that AnisoMPM works best when we use anisotropic damage and anisotropic elasticity together. Next, we show an isotropic tube under compression. This shows the successful modeling of isotropic damage as well as compressive fracture. Next, we add vertical fibers to the tube to give it anisotropic damage. Notice the nice clean split down the middle due to this structure. Next, we want to peel apart the layers of a piece of Dongpo pork belly using different anisotropic settings. First, we try Isotropy, but clearly this only allows us to tear a small piece away. Next, we add flat diagonal fibers to enable transverse isotropy, and now we're at least able to peel away a strip of the meat. Finally, we add a secondary fiber direction to model orthotropy, and can now peel apart the individual layers. We also color the particle damage in the top right to visualize the evolving planar crack. Next, we're inspired by the flow fiber generation of Saito et al. 2015 and simulate water flowing through this fish to generate the contoured fibers you see at right. And notice how as we skin the fish, the fracture nicely follows this complex curvature. Up next, our poor armadillo returns just in time for us to pierce it with a giant lance while it's held in place by elastic ropes. In this first run, the armadillo uses full anisotropic damage, while the ropes use anisotropic elasticity but no damage. And we also show in material space at right the flow fibers for the armadillo and ropes alike. Notice the nice clean fracture down the middle. This time the armadillo has isotropic damage, and we see that this causes the lance to simply push through the center with no directed crack at all. A fun fact, the inside of the armadillo was originally colored red, but a reviewer asked us to change it because it was disturbing. Next, we shoot some spheres through thin discs that each have a different fiber structure to them. Notice how the tears each directly follow the unique underlying structures that are visualized in the little circles. And also notice the subtle difference between the bottom left isotropic run and the bottom right run that has fibers that radiate outward from the center. Next, this transversely isotropic string cheese is pulled in 8 directions to partially peel apart the stringy fibers intrinsic to a pulled cheese like mozzarella. Next, this orange is simulated with radial fibers, each with its own local transverse isotropy. Next, we break this little plastic heart to show the successful pairing of AnisoMPM with MPM plasticity. Notice at the top that the heart tears with some additional plastic behavior. You can see little ductile peaks, and it also retains its deformed shape more than the run below. And finally, we tear apart some meat using isotropic damage first. Notice how without any fiber structure we just pull out a gross plug-shaped chunk. Of course, when we do add anisotropic damage, we get the characteristic tearing along the grain of the meat that we want. And here we again show the evolving damage. So now that we've seen all these approaches to modeling damage, let's explore designing elasticity for fracture. So first, let's quickly go over some existing elasticity approaches in graphics to get an idea of what's been done already. Many materials can be adequately modeled using linear elasticity because they truly do exhibit linearity under specific conditions, for example some metals. However, we frequently want to model materials that have nonlinear elastic relationships, for example biological tissue as seen at left. Additionally, most elasticity models cannot be trivially modified to additionally model anisotropy, and as such much work has gone into specifically modeling anisotropic elasticity. As early as 2015, Li et al. Introduced an approach for modeling linear orthotropic materials to moderate success, as you can see above right, and more recently, Jiang et al., yes that Jiang, introduced in 2017 a method for modeling the anisotropic response of cloth, and it's this work that AnisoMPM builds on for its anisotropic elasticity. But how do we actually design elasticity for fracture? Well, in most works that focus on LEFM, elasticity doesn't need to be heavily modified to allow for fracture because these works hinge on determining whether individual mesh connections have reached some stress threshold, and if they do, we simply break that connectivity. Conversely, in continuum damage mechanics, elasticity and damage are directly coupled through the aforementioned notion of elasticity degradation. So let's go into that a little bit more here. Recall that we achieve elasticity degradation by multiplying a monotonic degradation function, g, that's based on the current damage. The key here for fracture, however, is that we can choose to selectively degrade whatever contribution of the elastic energy that we want to weaken. And intuitively for fracture, this means that we want to selectively degrade the elasticity associated with tensile stress to allow for material separation under tension. As such, I've shown at the top the split energy density that we adopted for PFF-MPM. And notice that it's split to achieve a simple decomposition of the energy into tensile and compressive contributions. And with this split, all we need to do for fracture is multiply the tensile contribution by our monotonic degradation function. And as you can see by these tumbling armadillos, this split energy behaves very similarly to the neo-Hookean energy it's derived from. Additionally, the armadillo on the left uses the fixed corotated constitutive model that you're already familiar with. At right, we also visualize the split density in two ways. Above, we split it into its individual components to show each contribution to the total energy, and below we show different total energies for different phase values, demonstrating that the overall energy degrades as damage accumulates. Unfortunately, this approach to elasticity from CD-MPM is strictly isotropic. So in my work on AnisoMPM, we developed a fracture-friendly anisotropic constitutive model to capture anisotropic elasticity, because as you saw, modeling anisotropic damage alone is not enough to fully capture anisotropic fracture. So as I mentioned earlier, our anisotropic elasticity draws inspiration from earlier work on MPM cloth modeling, and is rooted in the QR decomposition of the deformation gradient. Here, Q is a rotation matrix, and R is an upper triangular matrix like shown. And similarly to the previous approach, we will write our energy density as an additive decomposition between tensile, compressive, and fiber contributions. However, before we detail that, we'll write our energy in more familiar terms. Specifically, we adopt the stable neo-Hookean energy density, which we break down into a shearing term, psi mu, and a volumetric term, psi lambda. The shearing term, as you can imagine, penalizes material shearing, and the volumetric term penalizes material dilation and contraction. To add anisotropic behavior to our model, we further introduce a fiber term, and this fiber term itself has two terms. The first penalizes stretches in the principal fiber direction with stiffness Kx, and the second penalizes stretching in the secondary direction with stiffness Ky. And we set Kx and Ky by multiplying the material's mu parameter by a fiber scale parameter, gamma. In this way, we enable AnisoMPM to model all modes of anisotropy by simply setting these gamma values. At right, we pull on some anisotropically elastic tubes and display their cross-sections. Notice that the isotropic tube contracts the same in every direction, the transversely isotropic tube shows less compression in the principal fiber direction, and finally, the orthotropic material shows that we can further scale the secondary fiber direction for less compression in that axis. We also find that our anisotropic constitutive model is robust to inversions and extremely large deformations, as seen by the random initialization and single-point recovery tests of the elastic gorilla at right. And excitingly, we also found that this QR approach to elasticity is over 3.4 times faster than SVD-based elasticity when we compute the stress derivatives we need to use. So now we can quickly take a look at the fracture effects attainable through tuning these elasticity parameters. We have Young's modulus, or E, and the fiber scaling, gamma. Notice how as we increase E, the material becomes harder and harder to fracture. Intuitively, this looks similar to when we experimented with changing the critical stress parameter. In the second row, however, we show in material space the cracks formed by increasing the fiber scaling, starting with isotropic elasticity for gamma 0. And notice that as we strengthen the principal fiber direction, the crack becomes sharper and clearer, again indicating that our approaches to damage and elasticity work best when paired together. Next, let's take a look at the way our energy density changes under different conditions. This first graph demonstrates the effect that increasing damage has on the energy density. Notice how the overall energy of the material decreases where there is damage. Next, we add transverse isotropy to the energy density by scaling the strength of the principal fiber direction. Notice how as we scale the strength of this direction, the energy strongly increases for stresses moving in the principal direction, meaning that the material will more strongly resist deformation in this direction. Lastly, we add orthotropy to the material by scaling both axes equally. Notice how the energy evenly increases in both directions now, meaning that we have now strengthened an entire plane of the material. And this is how the orthotropic pork belly tears away in planar sheets. So this approach to anisotropic elasticity does afford us some really exciting fracture results, like these qualitatively accurate bone fractures. Twisting produces a spiral fracture, pulling produces a transverse fracture, and bending produces an oblique fracture. However, extremely stiff materials like these bones still require prohibitively slow time steps to maintain numerical stability. In fact, these highly stiff bone demos were performed at almost 2,000 seconds per frame of simulation, as opposed to other less stiff demos that ran on the order of just 20 seconds per frame. As such, we want to explore how we can model this extreme stiffness without this limitation, and this finally brings us back to the inextensibility solver introduced in AnisoMPM. So first and foremost, don't worry too much about this math here, but I will give you a brief overview of the formulation behind inextensibility. So nonetheless, with that motivation in mind, we developed an embedded directional inextensibility solver that allows for the simulation of extremely stiff materials using hard constraints rather than the typical soft constraints that we associate with constitutive modeling. We begin with the inextensibility enforcing constraint at the top, where we see the time-dependent fiber direction A, as well as the Eulerian rate of strain tensor D, as shown to the right. With this constraint in hand, we may write a constrained equation for conservation of momentum, as shown in the second row. And notice that in this equation we introduce the notion of the full stress, which includes not only our isotropic stress sigma, but also some unknown tension along the fiber, represented in magnitude by the Lagrangian multiplier lambda. Ultimately, our goal is to construct a system to solve for velocity v and fiber tension lambda. We then derive a weak form of our constrained momentum equation and then discretize using MPM to get the system in the third row. Here, M is a diagonal matrix related to mass, both B matrices are filled with coefficients, V is a vector of unknown grid velocities, and lambda is a vector of unknown tensions. This is a sparse and symmetric KKT system, but not positive definite. Fortunately, we do not need to directly solve this system. Instead, we notice that we can eliminate V and end up with the system at the bottom, which can be more easily solved for lambda with iterative solvers like conjugate gradient descent and algebraic multigrid preconditioned CG. With lambda in hand, we can finally solve for the constrained and updated grid velocities. And fortunately, since our inextensibility solver is effectively just a hard constrained velocity solve, it's easily integrated into any existing MPM pipeline like you saw earlier. So now let's take a look at a couple of advantages of this inextensibility method. Here we show some hanging jello blocks, where the left two blocks are using inextensibility, and the right two blocks are simulated with anisotropic elasticity. Within each of these two pairs, the left block has fully parallel fibers, and the right block has slightly perturbed fibers. Notice that the yellow block on the right struggles to exhibit the behavior we expect due to a well-known phenomenon in elasticity research called locking. Further, we demonstrate here that our anisotropic elasticity also struggles to model extremely stiff materials without using very small time steps. The 6 tori on the left have ropes modeled with anisotropic elasticity, while the 2 on the right have inextensible ropes. And as you can see, our elasticity causes numerical fractures in the ropes carrying the heavier tori, while the inextensible ropes display very little displacement. Finally, our armadillo is not done yet because we also reran the anisotropic armadillo with inextensible ropes to show the successful pairing of anisotropic damage with inextensibility in the same simulation. Notice how the ropes bend and twist to avoid compressing as well as stretching, since these constraints are just about the distance. So now that we've covered fracture and elasticity, let's finally dive into plasticity. So, as I mentioned, some approaches to fracture don't use classical fracture mechanics at all, and instead seek to model the elastoplastic responses of the material, including plastic hardening and softening that can induce material separation on its own. And in fact, MPM plasticity has seen quite a bit of study in the past 10 years with works like the Disney Snow paper from 2013, seen at top left, and I believe Dr. Jiang will cover this soon actually, viscoplasticity for continuum foams on the bottom left, multi-species sediment flow that's capable of modeling a dam breaking, seen at the top right, and even the aforementioned thermodynamically rigorous snow model that's capable of predicting real-world avalanches on the bottom right. Now finally to give you some background on plasticity. When simulating plasticity, we typically do a multiplicative decomposition of the deformation gradient into its elastic and plastic components, seen through the progressive deformation of the bread at right. And we also need to choose a yield surface, which is effectively a 3D boundary in principal stress space that separates stresses into those that cause elastic deformations and those that cause plastic deformations. At right is a 2D slice of the Drucker-Prager yield surface cone in Kirchhoff's stress space to illustrate this. Points inside this surface represent stresses that cause elastic, recoverable deformations, whereas stresses outside cause plastic, irreversible deformations. And with this yield surface in hand, we can develop a return mapping routine that involves using the elastic deformation to determine where in stress space a particle is, and then, if necessary, projecting it back to a feasible stress state. And based on this projection, we also update a hardening variable per particle to keep track of the particle's plastic deformation. Now let's finally discuss this avalanche paper. This very large-scale snow simulation shows how a skier can remotely trigger an avalanche as the weak bottom layer of the snow slab propagates a crack far up the slope and then remotely causes fractures in the slab at the top, leading to this dangerous gravitational hazard. Gome et al. Were able to achieve this exciting result by using a plasticity model known as cohesive cam clay, which is adapted from a model originally developed in 1968 to model soil mechanics. So although it was originally formulated for soil, it works quite accurately for snow as well, and next you'll see that it also works beautifully for fracturing solids. So as part of CD-MPM, we introduced a non-associated cam clay, or NACC, plasticity model that begins with the cohesive cam clay yield surface used by the previous paper. Recall that when we perform return mapping, we need to keep track of a particle's plastic deformation. We do this through the hardening law near the top that updates the yield surface parameter P0. And since P0 is a core parameter of the yield surface related to hardening, the material's hardening actively changes the shape of the yield surface, and as such has a significant effect on which stresses are later considered elastic versus plastic for an individual particle. The key difference in our scheme is that we choose a non-associated flow rule, meaning that we do not project our stresses to the yield surface in an orthogonal manner, but instead project orthogonally to the hydrostatic axis, seen as the dotted diagonal line through the ellipsoid. We specifically choose this to avoid the volume gain inherent to some associated flow rules, since volume change would be unrealistic for a fracturing solid. As for our NACC return mapping, we treat 3 distinct cases based on the current particle's pressure, and at right you can see the yield surface in Kirchhoff's stress space, as well as the breakdown of these 3 cases. Cases 1 and 2 are fairly simple and only require projection to the well-defined ellipsoid tips, but case 3 does require us to solve an analytic quadratic equation that we get from the yield surface. Further, to facilitate material fracture, we further introduce a fracture-friendly hardening scheme that requires the introduction of the hardening variable alpha, seen plugged into the original hardening law above. This alpha is unique to each particle and tracks each particle's volumetric plastic deformation. And with this tracked information in our hardening scheme, the material is able to harden under compression and soften under tension, allowing these natural fractures to occur. Finally, we have two key parameters for artistic control in NACC plasticity, and we show at left a variety of material effects achievable simply through adjusting the initial state of alpha and the cohesion parameter beta. Now finally, let's take a look at our NACC plasticity demos. To demonstrate our fracture-friendly hardening, we visualize the particle alpha values in material space while these pumpkins smash in world space. The forming and merging red paths show where the material has softened enough to break apart, leaving dynamic material fractures in world space. Next, we smash an Oreo, simulated using different materials for the cookie and the cream, but only with NACC plasticity. And in general, we found NACC to be more successful for sort of brittle fractures like this. Next, we shatter a candy crab and again visualize the hardening parameter alpha in material space at right, again showing the material softening that allows for fracture. And again notice how as the candy shatters, these cracks form and merge in the clear crab. Finally, we smash a watermelon on the ground, again simulated with different materials for the rind and the flesh to give a rigid look and feel to the rind and a softer, juicier feel to the fruit. Last but not least, let's take a look at what we can do with MPM fracture in the real world. Here we see a large piece of glacial ice calving off into the ocean with an enormous splash and ensuing waves. Modeling this glacial calving is not only pertinent right now due to the inevitable sea level change due to global warming, but also because these types of calving events can cause fatal tsunamis that could dramatically affect coastal regions. So let's see how we can model this by making NACC plasticity more accurate. So while NACC plasticity does allow for the debris-laden fractures you just saw, it trades this optimal quality of volume preservation for a different problem. In particular, the non-associated return mapping requires solving a non-physical intersection problem to determine the plastic dissipation in some cases, due to there being no perceivable change in the pressure. This is why for NACC plasticity we had to label the volumetric plastic deformation as alpha, because in case 3 we can only approximate it. As such, in my third and final work we'll look at today, we present a new solution to this issue. Our idea is that instead of using the change in pressure for case 3 hardening, we can instead use the change in Q. More specifically, we're inspired by the quadratic relationship between P and J, and design a similar relationship between Q and a new J-like quantity, zeta. And we can analytically solve for zeta, and as such for the change in Q. Notice in this new yield surface diagram that the middle region's hardening is based on the vertical quantity delta Q. In the image at left, we show a 2D view of a rectangular glacier entering a body of water. Here the glacier has the tracked hardening variable in darker gray, and the water is colored based on velocity. And even more excitingly, we found that this new Q hardening model gives good quantitative agreement with analytic bending expressions for this type of ice and sea interaction, as you can see on the right. So here we simulate in 2D the real-world Ikipsirmia glacier moving into water. Notice the fracture, but more importantly, check out the propagating wave. This wave could potentially be catastrophic, so it's really exciting that we found the simulated wave speeds to nicely match analytic models and measurements. And finally, we can see here in 3D a glacier slowly pushing into the main body of water and gradually breaking apart due to plastic softening. Note that this simulation is of real-world scale with real-world parameters for ice and water, so this work truly has the potential to further our understanding of these sea-ice interactions and prevent these tsunami-related disasters. And this again is just one of the most exciting aspects of working with MPM for me. So now at long last, let's summarize what we've covered today. As for modeling fracture and damage, we saw how both PFF-MPM and AnisoMPM stand as strong approaches for simulating a breadth of fracture behavior, including for a variety of anisotropic materials. However, we're still missing the ability to model the very fast cracks associated with brittle materials like glass, and for my next project I'm excited about a couple of possible ways to address this, including recent research into modeling strong velocity discontinuities in MPM, and I'll actually give you a sneak preview of this in a second. Next, within modeling elasticity for fracture, we saw an isotropic split elasticity for PFF-MPM and a QR-based anisotropic elasticity for AnisoMPM. And while the inextensibility model could probably use some more exploration, it too is very successful for stiff materials. And in fact, one of the most interesting future directions for elasticity in fracture is to explore the potential intersection of machine learning and simulation through the possible leveraging of deep neural networks to learn to predict large time steps for very stiff materials. And finally, for plasticity, you saw a non-associated extension of CAM clay that we found extremely successful for modeling debris-laden solid fracture. And of course, even further, the Q hardening allows for even more physically accurate results using NACC plasticity. And as for future work in plasticity, it's an exciting prospect to try and develop an anisotropic yield surface to simulate anisotropic granular flow, which hasn't really seen much success yet in graphics. So as I mentioned, one of the exciting next directions for fracture modeling in MPM could be in trying to model brittle fracture. But for brittle fracture, we expect to have fast, sharp breaks with many pieces that collide and brush against each other. And as such, we're currently exploring a method in MPM called damage field gradient partitioning, or DFG, that allows for dynamically modeling strong velocity discontinuities. And so far it looks pretty successful based on these simple ramp sliding demos. But to see how this works with fracture, we'll have to wait and see, so stay tuned. So before we end today, let's take a look at a Tai Chi implementation of explicit MPM. Tai Chi is a really powerful tool for simulation due to its automatic optimization and nice data structures that encourage good data-oriented programming. So now I'll go through line by line to explain what's going on here. So we start with our import statements for Tai Chi and NumPy. You'll want to use NumPy arrays because they play more nicely with Tai Chi than Python lists. I've actually had a lot of trouble using Python lists with Tai Chi due to the lack of strong typing, so probably just avoid them if you can. Then in lines 6 to 13, we set up our simulation parameters like our number of particles, grid resolution dx and dt, and you want to be careful here that you make sure that your particle volumes are computed correctly as well as your particle mass. Then in lines 15 to 25, we set up our Tai Chi fields, which are the core data structures of Tai Chi that organize your data into fields of data, if that makes sense. For example, X is our field filled with particle positions, and we set up the data type for the field to be a 2x1 vector of type float, and the shape of the field is the number of particles by 1. So you can think of fields as sort of a skin for 2D or 3D arrays, which will be really useful here. And similarly, we set up our deformation gradient field F to be filled with 2x2 matrices. And then we have two more shapes for fields here. Our grid fields are shaped to be the number of grid nodes by the number of grid nodes, which will allow us to access these grid nodes more easily due to this structure, and you'll see that later. And finally, you see the last three fields here have an empty shape, which actually indicates the field is just a single variable and is accessed using the none keyword, which you'll see later when we use gravity, for example. And finally, I show here a little Tai Chi function to compute the Kirchhoff stress for the fixed co-rotated model. Tai Chi functions must be decorated with ti.func, and they can only be called from Tai Chi kernels, which in turn must be decorated with ti.kernel, which you'll see in a second. Next, we'll go through the Tai Chi kernel that will perform a single substep of simulation. Kernels cannot call other kernels, so kernels should be small and compact pieces of code that you expect to be run very frequently because it only gets compiled once. For this simple code, making your entire substep a kernel isn't a bad idea, but I've actually found that your code can run faster if you make your substep a Python scope function that calls kernels that each implement portions of the substep. So for example, writing a P to G kernel and a G to P kernel, and then calling them from your Python scope substep function. Also, we see here our first for loop. And for loops in Tai Chi are tricky because they're automatically parallelized at the outermost scope. So if you have two nested for loops, the outermost loop is parallelized while the innermost one is not. You can also force a chunk of code to be run in serial by wrapping it in a for loop that iterates once, so something like for serial in range 1. And you want to be careful of this parallelization because you can end up with data races. In any case, this first for loop is reinitializing our grid quantities to be zeroed out. Then we begin to iterate over each particle, and first we compute the base index, which is the grid index at the bottom left of the 3x3 grid node stencil that we use for quadratic B-spline interpolation. Then we compute fx, which we in turn use to compute the interpolation weights w and their gradient dw. Line 49 is where you could modify mu and lambda if you're trying to model materials other than Jello, but I'll leave this for you to explore. And line 51 performs an SVD on the deformation gradient, and then in lines 54 to 58, you have the opportunity to modify the deformation gradient to add plasticity. Then in line 61, we call the elasticity function I wrote to compute the Kirchhoff stress, which you may recall is equal to the Piola-Kirchhoff stress times F transpose. And next, in lines 64 to 78, we loop over the 3x3 grid node stencil for this particle, compute the force between particle P and the current grid node, And then lines 75 and 76 are adding up the contribution from particle P's mass and momentum to this current grid node. And then finally in line 78 we add the force contribution. And notice that we are using apic transfer here, so we have the additional C matrix of velocity derivatives. Next, we're still in the substep kernel, and now it's time to add the contributions of gravity and collisions. So here we iterate over all of the active grid nodes, and then first we divide out the grid mass from the grid momentum so that we have grid velocity. And before we were transferring momentum, so grid V actually held momentum before. Then we can simply add on the contribution of gravity in line 85, and we additionally add some forces from the mouse click since the simulation is set to run in a small interactive GUI. And then in lines 91 to 95, we have a simple collision routine where we basically are just checking grid velocities at the grid nodes near the walls of this 1x1 unit square simulation region. And we're setting the x or y components of velocity to be 0 based on this, and this gives a nice and simple non-sticky collision. Finally, we have G2P from lines 97 to 120. Here we again iterate over particles, compute our interpolation weights, and then iterate over the grid node stencil to compute the contributions from the grid nodes to the particle. And finally at the end we set our new velocity, new C matrix, new positions, and update our deformation gradient. Lastly, we have a reset kernel here that we use to sample particles in line 126 and initialize other quantities. And this is where you can also fill the material field so that you can try a simulation with multiple materials. So for example, you could set the material to be 0 for fluid, 1 for jello, and 2 for snow, and then use these flags to modify portions of the substep routine for particles of those respective materials. In line 134, we initialize the Tai Chi GUI, and then afterwards we call the reset kernel from Python scope. And then we use the none keyword, you might remember, to access the gravity field, and we can set it here to whatever we want. Then finally, in lines 138 to 159 are the main simulation loop, including getting keyboard and mouse inputs, calling our substep kernel, and rendering our particles to the GUI. And the GUI has a good amount of fun stuff you can do with it, but there's also a way to export PLY files from Tai Chi, which would allow you to do rendering in Houdini, so I would suggest starting with the GUI for 2D and then switching to exporting files for 3D. And the documentation online for Tai Chi is also really helpful, and there's so much you can do with it, but I hope that this little overview has helped. So in any case, thanks so much for listening, and I hope I've inspired you to learn more about NPM, or get into research, or even just dive headfirst into that NPM project. So good luck, and we can't wait to see what y'all make!